It's my pleasure to be here. Hi, everyone. I'd like to start by telling a story of Jimmy. Jimmy walked into my lab a couple years ago after suffering two strokes in 2007. The strokes that's damage to the brain, left him severely impaired. He was having trouble moving his right arm, as you can see on this picture, right leg, and he spent years doing intensive therapy, trying everything to improve, and he did improve a lot, to the point where one day he was telling me he was driving to work, and suddenly his right arm came up and grabbed the wheel and helped driving. So stories like Jimmy's and others like him motivate me to do research in neuroengineering, and the main motivation is to help people like him to improve rehabilitation methods, to make them more efficient. And another motivation is to understand how the brain works. How is this miraculous recovery of Jimmy is possible? So I will first acknowledge the funding agencies that support this work. And of course, no research is possible without talented people. This is my lab and the lab of my collaborator, Sergey Yakovenko. Dr. Yakovenko is in West Virginia University. And I work closely with many brilliant colleagues. Dr. Popov from KPI is here, and Dr. Gont and Dr. Boninger are professors from University of Pittsburgh. They contributed to the neuroprosthetics study I will talk today about. And Dr. Rosen and Dr. Bhatia are our clinical neurosurgery team, collaborating in other projects in WVU, West Virginia University. We also have Vijay Rajasekaran. She is a neurologist in West Virginia University. And Dr. Gauthier is from Ohio State University. She does gamified rehabilitation therapy and works with us to translate our methods into actual rehab. So first, brief introduction, what happened to Jimmy. He has had a stroke, which means that in his case, an artery is blocked, and part of the brain was starved of oxygen. So it died, and often that part of the brain is the one that controls movement. And here, the video didn't play, but here what happens is that the brain is very modular structure. It has different components that work closely together to produce movement. We have these cortical areas here that involve the planning of the movement, and then we have cerebellum that contributes, and then we have the spinal cord that sends information down to muscles, and then muscles make the movement happen. And of course, for most of you engineers, it would be interesting to know that we often, neuroscientists, I'm a neuroscientist by training, think of the body as a mechanical system. It's like a complex robot with 230 joints. And some joints have more than 1 degree of freedom, and 630 muscles. So that is like having a robot with more than 230 degrees of freedom and 630 motors to produce the movement. The arm alone has 37 joints and 24 muscles. So it's a complicated machine, and our nervous system, I have a schematic here that generally illustrates how we think everything is organized, starts with the decision making. So we have these high-level cortical areas, plan the movement first. Then we have movement execution, so a controller that now executes the plan. So we have all these descending structures that goes down to the muscles, and then the muscles contract, move the bones, and the body interacts with the environment here. And we have multiple feedback pathways, sensory pathways that from the sensors embedded in our muscles and tendons and joints that inform the control about what's happening. So the control is a complex feed-forward and feedback system. So when we make the movement, of course, now physics come to mind. Muscles contract, cause the body segments to rotate around the joints, and the force of muscle contraction is transformed into joint moment. So we study these joint moments that are that are coming from muscle contractions to understand how the brain controls the movement. So this is a simple Newtonian equation here, and we have different components. Muscle contractions produce these muscle torques or muscle moments that we call them, and then gravity acts on the limb, of course, causing additional forces that the nervous system now has to compensate for. And then there's joint interactions that, again, the nervous system has to account for as well. So here we have what we can observe directly are muscle moments or muscle torques that are the result of neural activity, result of our neural controller. So the first experiment I will talk about today is a study of how is gravity taken into account by the neural controller. And this is my graduate student here, Iriya Nolesh. She's done most of this work. And we are motivated by, to find out the answer to this question because we thought that knowing this answer will help design better robotic controllers. If we know how the brain does it, we can design a biomimetic controller for gravity compensation for any kind of robot. So she did an experiment with 9 healthy people. They were pointing in virtual reality. And I hope this will play. Oh, here we go. So this will show how the experiment was done. So the subject or participant was seated. These lights you see on the person were LEDs, light emitting diodes that we were tracking to reconstruct joint angles in time. So we're doing motion capture, just like they do in the movies or in the cartoons nowadays. And we record also muscle activity. And people are pointing to these targets in virtual reality, and virtual reality just creates an environment to kind of instruct the subject where to move and how fast to move. So these are my students had fun with this video. So what we record are these kinematic variables, so joint angles in time, and this is an illustration here of just angular position for 2 degrees of freedom. So in blue, it's a shoulder flexion extension, rotation around the axis for flexion extension, and in red, it's abduction adduction, so motion sideways. And for that, for one movement, for one subject, and then we have angular velocity. And from these kinematic variables, we can reconstruct joint torques. And we, as I said, we're particularly interested in muscle torques. So we have this muscle torque example. And then from that information, we can also subdivide that muscle torque into part that's responsible for gravity control and everything else. We call it inertial torque. So we have gravitational torque and we have inertial torque. Now that we have these variables, we can compare how these variables change in time with the muscle activation that we are recording separately. So here's an example of muscle activity for 3 muscles during the same movement. And you can see that it's quite noisy, very intercorrelated. To make sense of this information, we use decomposition methods to reduce data dimensionality. And again, this is inspiration from engineering. So here we use non-negative matrix factorization on all these signals. And then we compared dimensionality reduced data between muscle activity and motion signals. So to make the story short, we basically find that if we compare all these muscle activations here with, so components derived from muscle activations, and all the different variables, we find that most of the relationships, and bright red color means high correlations in this correlation matrix, most of the relationships are with the gravity torque. So the component of the muscle torque that's responsible for gravity compensation. So this study suggests that the neural motor command, the neural control, calculates this gravitation signal and actively compensates for it. Now, this kind of research is now becoming possible not only in the lab, but in a home-based setting. So the technology like Kinect by Microsoft that does whole body motion capture for $200. Compare that with this lab-based motion capture, which costs $50,000 several years ago, and now several $1,000s still. Leap motion controller that you see the video here does very good tracking of the hands, and it's fully integrated with virtual reality, and it's also a couple $100s. And the Vive trackers, all this new tech can be fairly easily ported for home use. So how can this be used? Well, we have a startup company that's supported by the West Virginia University. It's called NeuroWired, and we develop algorithms to use motion capture and other biological signals for rehabilitation, for clinicians. So here's a study that Irian did while she did her grad school with me, where she found that using algorithm-based quantification of impairment, so measuring automatically how much the person has trouble moving after a stroke, is as good, is very good. So it basically can predict very well subjective scores by physical therapists. And if we look at the histogram here, the algorithm is in red. It does as well as the best physical therapy graduate students available out of, we had 50 graduate students to do the scoring. So the algorithm is working pretty well already, and this technology can be translated into patients' homes, into hospitals and clinics, and can be used to track first impairment and then recovery. Now, another story I'll tell you today is a computational approach that helped us understand what can anatomy tell us about neural control. Here, we've used the model, a dynamical model of the musculoskeletal system. So this picture you see, it's a picture of the model that simulates the physics of the body, so inertia of the limb masses and how they're connected, the degrees of freedom in all these joints in the hand, and muscles, muscle paths, and their origin and insertion points, so where all the muscles are located on the arm. So in this model, we have 52 muscles and 27 degrees of freedom. And what we've done is we've simply explored the whole space of possible postures. So this video shows how we put the model in all the possible arm postures for every muscle that we have in this model. So for every muscle, whichever degrees of freedom this muscle spans, we explored those postures, and we calculated muscle length for it, for each of those postures. And this is a work in collaboration with Dr. Yakovenko and his team, so Anton Sobinov, his graduate student, and Matthew Booth here, and some of you know Oleg Bodilovsky. We're all working on this project. So we calculated all the possible muscle lengths for all the possible physiological postures, and we cross-correlated between them. So here you see a correlation matrix between all the muscles, muscle lengths, and these are upper arm muscles and these are lower arm muscles. And bright yellow colors mean high positive correlations, deep blue, dark blue colors mean high negative correlations. And you can see right away there's structure there. So the muscle anatomy, as expressed by these muscle lengths, already has structures that roughly you can see sort of an upper arm muscle cluster where muscle lengths are all connected to each other, correlated with each other positively or negatively. Very strong hand, distal, so lower arm muscle cluster. So without too much detail, we did hierarchical clustering on this, and we found these functional modules that muscles themselves create. So here's an example of a functional module that can help grasp an object, that kind of opens the hand. Here's an example of module that just good for lifting the arm. It flexes the elbow, prepares the arm for reaching. So without any neural control, it seems like anatomical organization of the muscles themselves helps to simplify movement control. Now, another study we did actually looks at the control system architecture of the nervous system. And here, instead of focusing on all the details of this complicated schematic, we studied a simplified controller. So we just looked at the overall gain of this feed-forward pathway. So from motor cortex to the muscle, and the first feedback that's available, and that is this, this 1A feedback from sensors embedded in the muscles. So to study the feed-forward gain, we use this non-invasive transcranial magnetic stimulation. So we stimulated the motor cortex, and for studying this feedback loop, we used simulations. We used the model I just mentioned to simulate sensory feedback. So transcranial magnetic stimulation is a way that's used primarily for research, but also is used clinically. And here's my graduate student, Russell Hardesty, is using this, holding a giant, fairly large magnet over a person's head, and creates a magnetic field that causes this kind of current density in the brain and causes some parts of the motor cortex, some cells in the motor cortex to fire, and then to travel down this feed-forward pathway and activate the muscles. So we actually pick up these responses here from the muscles as we stimulate the brain. And we can look at the sizes of the responses and estimate the feed-forward gain that way. And then our participants were doing an experiment similar to the one I just showed, where they were pointing in virtual reality. But here we only chose few movements that are of particular interest to us. And I think he's just showing the first person's view of the experiment. So we are recording movement again, doing motion capture, and recording muscle activity as well. So first, how did we model sensory feedback? Well, we used this published model that describes the relationship between muscle length, change in length of muscle length during movement, and muscle activity, and the output of the sensory neurons. So we already have our model to calculate the muscle activity, to calculate the muscle length and length in change of length during movement, and we record muscle activity. So we could easily calculate firing rate of the sensors. And what we can do is we can compare how the activity of the sensors compares to the activity of the muscles. So here I'm just plotting for the two movements. Here's movement 2 and movement 3 out of 3. First, this is a correlation matrix for all the muscle activity, and you can see that muscle activity are highly correlated, as I said before, but they group in different clusters in two different movements. Now, interestingly, when we look at the same for the sensors, they're also structured, but they're structured differently. And we could look directly, of course, at the relationships between muscle activations and sensory feedback. And again, we see which part of the information is shared there. So hierarchical clustering, again, was really interesting because it found in this sensory feedback the same kind of modules. So we find the same modules in these movements that we find with muscle length anatomy. So from that, we can conclude that the sensory feedback seems to encode the kinematic state of arms' functional modules. So they're more in the domain of kinematics, motion, it's not forces. And then when we look at the gains, we can compare the contribution of the feed-forward pathway from this cortical stimulation responses and simulated sensory feedback. And here in orange, I'm plotting the feed-forward pathway, blue is feedback, and you can see that for all three movements, most of the activation of the muscles comes from this feed-forward signal. So we can conclude from this that the assembly and recruitment of these functional modules are still done by the descending feed-forward cortical signal, more so than directly from the sensory. This method can also be used to analyze impairment or analyze functional problems that people are experiencing after a neurological damage like stroke. This is a giant correlation matrix, but here we have a control subject and a patient, somebody who's had a stroke. And this is just showing correlations between muscle activation. This is a right arm and left arm of a control subject, and then we have right arm and left arm of the patient. And usually stroke affects one arm more than the other because it happens in one hemisphere. So in this patient, it's the right arm that's more impaired. So you can see right away that we can compare the relationships in a healthy person of the same age between right and left arm and in a patient, and these relationships are different. And we can quantify that difference. Again, here we can look at just the overall number of shared variants. In red is a patient, and you can see much fewer high correlations than in the control. And we can also tell that some movements are more affected than others. So here, there's a big difference between the control and patient for this movement, and there's hardly any difference here. So we can tell now the therapists which movements would be more predictive of impairment and which movements they should be focusing on during therapy. And this approach can be automated as well. Whether we're recording motion or we're recording muscle activity, we can apply these algorithms that will then quantify the amount of movement problems and track the person's recovery. Now, there's another way to use this computational and experimental approach, and this is a project that is in collaboration with the University of Pittsburgh here, and with Ripple, which is a company. It was represented by Dan Merrill, who I think visited KPI last year. So Ripple manufactures these devices that can be implanted in the muscles or in the nervous system and in the brain as well. For this project, we're using the device for muscle implantation that picks up muscle activity. It's fully implanted and it wirelessly transmits the activity to this portable processor, they call it Grapevine, that runs our model of the musculoskeletal dynamics. And that model transforms the muscle activation signals into control signals for the robotic hand and drives the robotic hand. Now, the idea for this project is actually pretty big, and it's to create a Luke Skywalker hand. That's for all of you Star Trek fans. So that the person can not only think and the movement will happen of the robotic hand, but they would also feel the movement. So for the feeling, the motion of the robot is also being passed through those sensory models I just showed, and the sensory models now inform stimulation of sensory roots of the spinal cord, so that when the subject touches an object or moves the finger of the robotic hand, they feel it move, feel that finger move, or they feel the touch. So here's a video that shows the motor aspect and how it works right now. You can't hear the sound, unfortunately, but here we go. Maybe, but basically, it says relax.
Okay, can you stick all your fingers out straight?
Make fingers straight. So what the person with amputee, the person without the hand, has implanted electrodes, and we're picking up that signal, and it's driving the model that is running on the computer, and then that model is controlling the robotic hand, which is right now not attached to him, but it's a proof of principle.
Okay, so relax.
So I'll play it again, but he says, it says make a fist.
Relax.
Relax.
And just bring your index finger in.
Bring your index finger in.
Okay.
It not always work quite as well as we'd like.
Okay, can you stick all your fingers out straight? So straight.
Make fingers straight.
Okay, relax.
Relax.
Okay. Flex your wrist in.
Flex your wrist.
Wrist in.
Has a bit more trouble.
And then, yeah.
And fist, make a fist.
Fingers out. Put your fingers out.
Fingers out.
Yeah. Okay, relax.
So as you can see, there's stability problems. Sometimes it's a little bit slow, but that's the state of the art in this field. So there's another project where we're working with Ripple on and with our neurosurgery colleagues in West Virginia University, and that is to implant one of those electrode grids onto the brain. And now this would be more useful for people with brain damage, somebody who's had a stroke or some brain trauma. And the same approach can be used. So what we're planning to do is we plan to stimulate in a pattern these damaged cortical areas and around them to improve the movement of a person with impairment. And I'd like to thank everyone for listening. This is my lab in WVU, and if anyone is interested in graduate school, come talk to me. Thanks.
Thank you very much for a very exotic presentation.
Excellent.
Please, question.
So part of the reason for modeling approach is to compensate for that noise. Again, because of all these noisy signals are correlated in a functional way, we think that will help reduce the noise. So as we have many actuators we're recording from, so many muscles we're recording from, together they will converge on smaller number of degrees of freedom that we're controlling, and that synergistic action will help deal with the noise problem, so it'll be reliable. But we still have noise issues, and that video shows it a little bit, that we need to be very precise in how we interpret the signal. Yeah.
Any more questions?
For analysis, we transform everything into dimensionless units relative to maximum activity in a given movement. There are several ways to normalize it, but the modeling approach also helps us assign dimensions of force to the muscle activity as well, because we have a muscle model built in. So when we do optimization for first creating inverse solutions and then optimizing for muscle activations, we actually can assign units to the muscle activity. But we record them in volts, but then of course they don't mean anything. In volts, it's the electrical activity of the muscle that we record.
Please.
With the simulated sensation, I'll answer your last question first. So to estimate what is damaged, I think it's possible in a very gross way. So we could say, for example, if it's more likely that the feed-forward pathway is more damaged than the feedback pathways. And often we know that already because the damage would be in the brain. But we hope that in the future it will be more possible to separate into maybe these functional units, which functional units are more damaged than the other. So it would not necessarily be related to anatomy of where the damage is, but to the network property, which network property is missing, or which part of those modules is damaged or not doing the processing correctly. Is it maybe the gravity is not calculated correctly now, wherever the damage is? So that is the question we are trying to answer now with this research. But the solutions are possible in forward and inverse ways. So you could go from neural recordings and try to predict the movement, and you can also record the movement and predict the neural activity that should be happening to make that movement happen. Both have their challenges.
I think it's time to move to the next presentation. So thank you very much.